Let's talk about the pharmacology of marijuana. Why do we get high? We are social beings, and some of us have had such a tough go of it that we can't really imagine being in a room with other people sober. Maybe it's too scary. Maybe we crave that connection, but we don't get it without some sort of chemical aid. And there's four main reasons why people get high. The four main reasons are emotional problems, like you're sad, you're upset, you're stressed out, you're angry, whatever. Those would be negative emotional states. Another reason would be social settings or positive events. We live in a culture where it is culturally acceptable to, when you go to a party, you are expected to bring some sort of alcohol or party favor or something to the host of the party. So when your friends ask you to go out, they're not asking you to just go out. They're asking you to go out and drink or go out and use. When we go out of town on vacation, most people want to drink in excess or use substances in excess. New Year's Eve, birthday parties, holidays, things like that. People use alcohol and substances to celebrate and have a good time. The third category is physical pain. This can be when you have a headache, when you have chronic pain issues, when you have a backache, when your knees hurt you, when you are tired and you want to lift yourself up. So you use some sort of stimulant like caffeine or cocaine or something like that, Adderall. Or even when you dream about using drugs would fall under that particular category. And then cravings and urges fall under the withdrawal category. When we are withdrawing from a substance, it's going to be one of the hardest times to not use that substance. So we learned a little bit about the history of marijuana in the last lesson. So let's take a look at a little bit of the terminology here. Cannabis refers to the genus of flowering plants in the family Cannabicae. And while hemp and marijuana are regularly referred to as a species or strains of cannabis, they actually don't qualify as either one. In fact, they couldn't technically be considered plants at all. Hemp and marijuana are simply just broad classifications of cannabis that were adopted into our culture, but they're not legitimate nomenclature for the cannabis plant. So to clarify the difference between hemp and marijuana and kind of, so to speak, clear the smoke on this frequently misinformed subject, we're going to explore a little bit of what these terms actually mean and how they relate to cannabis. Marijuana refers specifically to the flowering buds and the leaves of the cannabis plant. This term is used to classify the varieties of cannabis that contain more than 0.3% THC by dry weight. And the THC induces the psychotropic and euphoric effects on the user. And while this term is widespread throughout American culture, it presents a grossly inadequate misrepresentation of cannabis. Most informed individuals and organizations in the cannabis industry prefer to use the term, and they consider it kind of racist. In early American history, the term marijuana was non-existent, and cannabis was the primary term used to classify the plant. Between 1910 and 1920, nearly a million Mexicans migrated into the U.S. seeking refuge from the Mexican Revolution. And during this time, anti-Mexican sentiment had begun to kind of steep, and the term marijuana rose as a negative correlation of its use by the Mexican immigrants. So hemp is a term that's used to classify the varieties of cannabis that contain 0.3% or less of THC content by dry weight. So while the legal definition described hasn't been legitimized until the Agricultural Act of 2018, and we'll talk about that later. But once that Agricultural Act of 2018 passed, hemp was generally being used to describe the non-intoxicating cannabis that's harvested for industrial use of its derived products. And hemp is the strongest natural fiber in the world, with over 50,000 known uses. People use them for textiles like clothing, diapers, handbags, industrial textiles like rope, canvas, carpet, paper, food like hemp seed oil, hemp, the hemp protein powder, building materials like solvents, insulation, fiberglass substitutes, oil paints. And then we use it for body care like soaps, shampoos, lotions, cosmetics, things like that. The defining characteristic between the two is really based on just a single factor, and that's just the amount of the THC in the plant, or rather, whether it's going to get the user high. And while the intoxicating properties of each plant is an important factor to consider in categorizing cannabis as either hemp or marijuana, based on just that single characteristic, it kind of presents a skewed portrayal of cannabis, which prevents users from fully understanding its diversity. So to kind of give you a comparison, consider the taxonomic hierarchy of fruits in the citrus species. Categorizing cannabis as either hemp or marijuana is akin to classifying all fruits in the citrus genus as either sweet or sour, without acknowledging the diverse characteristics of each fruit. And in addition, hemp and marijuana can also appear indistinguishable from one another. And this has already led to numerous issues of law enforcement officers making arrests and seizing hemp that's 100% legal because it looks exactly like marijuana. The classification of hemp or marijuana, absent of a true understanding of cannabis, presents a really clear issue of function. The obvious solution is for each of these words to have never existed. However, now that these terms have become deeply ingrained in our society, this problem is going to be difficult to reverse. The only realistic solution here is to re-educate our society over time. But there's 4 key differences here between hemp and marijuana, so let's kind of talk about this. The first one is the composition. The defining characteristic between hemp and marijuana is the chemical composition contained within each plant. Both hemp and marijuana can produce really high amounts of CBD, which is the non-intoxicating cannabis compound. But THC is produced at very different levels. So while hemp can contain no more than 0.3% THC, marijuana can contain up to 30% THC content. And even more with today's biochemical engineering processes. The second piece is the legality of it. And due to the difference between their levels of THC, hemp and marijuana are regulated very differently under the law. While hemp was previously regulated as an illegal substance under the Controlled Substance Act of 1970, it was removed as an illegal substance under the Agricultural Improvement Act of 2018. And that federally legalized hemp and any hemp-derived products that contain no more than the 0.3% THC. The third difference here is how it's cultivated. Hemp and marijuana are harvested for different purposes, so naturally they require different growing conditions. Marijuana varieties are selectively bred in controlled environments, which are designed to optimize the breed's characteristics and produce the female plants that yield these budding flowers. So to properly cultivate a marijuana or a cannabis plant, the grower has to pay very close attention to the plant at each stage of its life cycle and maintain the exact conditions in its environment, like the proper temperature, the proper lighting, the proper humidity. But in contrast, hemp is grown just to maximize its size and its yield. So to achieve this, hemp is typically grown outdoors, and it doesn't require that level of control and attention that's necessary to grow marijuana. And then the fourth difference here is the usage. hemp and marijuana each offer a range of uses which are unique to their composition. As a powerful psychoactive agent, THC can directly bind to our CB1 and CB2 receptors in our endocannabinoid system. We'll talk about that later. And that is what induces the mind-altering euphoric effects that are referred to as being high. So while marijuana is commonly recognized for its recreational uses, studies have revealed its potential in a wide variety of therapeutic applications. In comparison, hemp is just harvested to produce a wide variety of products. There are over 120 different types of cannabinoids. Cannabinoids are the molecules that are found inside of the cannabis plant. But two are found in higher concentrations that are thought to lead to those physiological and psychological effects of cannabis, and we know those as being THC and CBD. But there are over 120 of them. So let's talk about some of these that you see here on the screen over the next few slides. So THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, is the most abundant and widely known cannabinoid in cannabis. It's the cannabinoid that's responsible for the main psychoactive effects that we are familiar with, and it causes that euphoric mental state or sedation, but it is dose dependent. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a few moments, but it's generally found in higher concentrations in recreational cannabis, and it's used for pain relief and can increase appetite, paranoia, anxiety, things like that, which we'll talk more about towards the end of this lesson. The other chemical that's found in high concentrations in cannabis is called CBD, or cannabinol. With respect to the medical potential of cannabis, CBD may hold the most promise in many serious conditions. CBD is the non-psychoactive cannabinoid that's believed to reduce the psychoactive effects of the THC. When I say non-psychoactive, think the blood-brain barrier. We know that opioids cross that blood-brain barrier, like morphine will cross that blood-brain barrier. But Imodium is also an opioid, and it does not cross the blood-brain barrier, so it does not get us high. So we know that CBD is that non-psychoactive cannabinoid that does not cross the blood-brain barrier and get us high. And it is reducing those psychoactive effects in the THC. So the CBD in cannabis reduces the effects of the THC. The higher the CBD, the less the THC is going to affect you. The therapeutic benefits of CBD are that it can be used as an analgesic, an anti-inflammatory, anti-antileptic, and it does have anxiolytic properties like anti-stress. There's also THCV, or tetrahydrocannabivarin, which is found in the largest quantities in cannabis varieties that are indigenous to Central Africa, like certain phenotypes from Malawi. And it's currently being researched for metabolic disorders like diabetes, and it serves as a potential appetite suppressant. A lot of recreational users report not being able to eat without smoking beforehand, and this particular cannabinoid is probably the culprit for that. Then we have CBN, or cannabinol. And this is a mildly psychoactive cannabinoid that comes from the degradation of THC, so when it's degrading. And there's usually very little CBN in a fresh plant. It's considered mildly psychoactive, and it's known for its very powerful sedative properties. When the THC is oxidized or exposed to oxygen, the degradation process converts the THC into the CBN, which might account for the sedation effect in aged cannabis. And it's a byproduct of the THC. And it's typically found in most cannabis strains, but a lot of the cannabis-based options like topicals and edibles, capsules, tinctures, vape cartridges, sublingual sprays, and all that stuff that sits on the shelf can contain higher levels of this cannabinoid because they've been sitting on the shelf for a long time, and so the THC is degrading into the CBN. And it was also the first cannabinoid that was isolated. We didn't find THC first. We found CBN first. And we thought at first that this was what was responsible for the psychoactive effects of cannabis before we discovered THC. And we can use it to effectively battle insomnia and reduce anxiety. And it can be the most effective for inducing sleep in combination with other cannabinoids like THC and CBD. Then we have CBC, or cannabichromamine. This is one cannabinoid that's often overlooked. It's one of the most beneficial and important cannabinoids that we should start to learn more about. CBC is typically present in relatively small amounts in cannabis and also in hemp. And along with its anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties, CBC has been known to stimulate brain growth. And it's considered to have anti-proliferative or inhibiting the growth of cancerous tumors attributes. So in addition to these already amazing benefits, CBC is believed to be helpful with the treatment of migraines, as well as stimulating that brain growth. This really powerful cannabinoid is also thought to work as an antidepressant. And with all of that going for it, why haven't we heard more about this cannabinoid? Well, in short, because there's a lack of federal testing on it. It bears a structural similarity to the other natural cannabinoids like THC, THCV, and the CBN. And within this cannabis plant, CBC occurs mainly as a cannabichromic acid, or CBCA. Geranyl pyrophosphate and this is such a hard word to say, olivetolic acid, they combined to produce the cannabidioric acid, or CBGA, which is then cyclized by the enzyme CBCA, synthesized to form the CBCA. And over time, when it's heated somewhere above 200 degrees Fahrenheit, this CBCA is decarboxylized and it produces the CBC. So we get this when we set it on fire, basically. And the reason there's been no testing is because it's federally illegal, by and large, and we've only been able to do non-in vivo human studies on this cannabinoid to date. So we're not really sure what it does to humans, but we know what it does to mice. Then we have CBL, or cannabicyclol, and this is a non-psychoactive cannabinoid. It's a degradative product like the CBC or the CBN, and the light converts the cannabichromine, or the CBC, into the CBL, and it makes it a photocannabinoid. So when it's exposed to light, we get the CBC then turns into the CBL. And it's typically found in longer stored doses of cannabis, like products that we find sitting on a shelf for a long period of time, because it is degradative. Now let's talk a little bit more about this 2018 Farm Bill. So back in December of 2018, the agricultural bill, or the 2018 Farm Bill, was signed into law, and it removed hemp. And they defined hemp as cannabis. We can say cannabis sativa L, and its derivatives of cannabis with extremely low concentration of the psychoactive compound delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. So basically no more than 0.3% THC on a dry weight basis. And from the definition of marijuana, they removed it from that definition under the Controlled Substances Act. So the 2018 Farm Bill explicitly preserved the FDA's authority over hemp products. Therefore, hemp products must meet any applicable FDA requirements and standards, just like any other FDA-regulated product. So, for example, the FDA's existing authority over food and dietary supplements, human and veterinarian drugs, and cosmetics will also apply to hemp products to the extent that, such hemp products fall within those categories. So these safeguards are there to help ensure that Americans have access to safe and accurately labeled hemp products. And in the case of drugs, that patients can depend on the effectiveness of these products. So in late 2018, the FDA advanced 3 hemp seed-derived food products through the agency's generally recognized as SAFE process, or GRAS. Hemp seeds don't naturally contain cannabinol, or CBD, or THC, which are cannabinoid compounds that are found in other parts of the cannabis plant. They're found in the flower, basically. The hemp seed products, whole hemp seed protein powder, hemp seed oil, can be legally used in the U.S. food supply. Any food products made with these hemp seed ingredients are subject to those same FDA requirements as any other food, such as those regulated to ingredient and nutrition labeling, as well as the Risk-Based Prevention-Focused Food Safety Modernization Act safeguards. The current regulatory state of play is a little bit more complex when it comes to hemp products that contain CBD. It is unlawful under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the FD&C Act, to introduce into interstate commerce of food, including any animal food or feed, to which has been added a substance that is an active ingredient in an approved drug product, or a substance for which substantial clinical investigations have been instituted, and the existence of such investigations have been made public. Similarly, these types of substances are outside of the statutory definition of dietary supplement. These provisions in our statute exist to protect patients and to preserve American patients' access to the most safe and advanced pharmaceutical system in the world. And I think everybody can understand why, in general, adding drugs like blood pressure medicines or chemotherapeutics to foods or to products marketed as dietary supplements might not be in the best interest of American consumers and patients. So in June 2018, the FDA approved the drug Epidiolex, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit, but they approved Epidiolex for treatment of seizures that are associated with 2 very rare and severe pediatric diseases. And the approval of this medicine was a very significant milestone for these patients and their families. The active ingredient in this drug is CBD. And based on both the approval of this drug as well as the previous substantial clinical investigations of CBD cannot be marketed as a dietary supplement. And foods to which CBD has been added cannot be introduced into interstate commerce under the FD&C Act. The FD&C Act provisions that prohibit adding an active drug ingredient to foods or marketing an active drug ingredient as a dietary supplement contain an exception if the drug was marketed in foods and dietary supplements before the drug was approved and before it was subject to substantial clinical investigations. But the agency is not aware of any evidence that CBD was ever marketed in foods or dietary supplements before it being subject to substantial clinical investigation. So therefore, the FDA has concluded this exception does not apply to CBD. So the FD&C Act further allows for the agency to make an exception through notice and comment rulemaking to one or both of the provisions that prohibit adding active drug ingredients to foods or marketing them as dietary supplements. So it's going to be important to note that it can take 3 to 5 years to even complete an expedited notice. And comment rulemaking process that complies with that Administrative Procedure Act and other requirements. So completing a rulemaking requires the agency to develop this robust record to support the rulemaking, including economic analysis, and to consider public comments, which can be voluminous when rulemaking concern substantive topics for which there is an extensive public interest, as is the case with CBD. Creating an exception for an active drug ingredient to be used in either foods or dietary supplements would make sense only if we could determine that products would be able to meet the other relevant safety standards in the FD&C Act, like the food additive safety standards for human or animal foods, or the new dietary ingredient standards for dietary supplements. If we were to create an exception under one provision of the FD&C Act, but other provisions of that statute are still barring products from coming to the market, our action could end up generating additional confusion in the marketplace, and that's a result the agency believes all stakeholders would just prefer to avoid. So the FDA recognizes that 3 to 5 years is a long time to wait for regulatory clarity, particularly given the significant public interest in hemp products and CBD in particular. The agency is exploring options to reach a resolution a little bit more quickly and a little bit more efficiently. So the 2018 Farm Bill removed hemp, which includes THC derivatives of cannabis, like CBD products, from the definition of marijuana in the Controlled Substances Act. I cannot overstate how significant of a policy change this has been. Prior to the enhancement of the 2018 Farm Bill, the Controlled Substances Act did not differentiate between marijuana and hemp, and all cannabis, with certain exceptions like sterilized seeds and mature stalks of the plant, was a Schedule I substance, and therefore it was controlled by the Drug Enforcement Administration, or the DEA. Early interest in this clinical research was focused on the development of drugs using THC rather than CBD. But more recently, interest in CBD as a drug is increasing. And as I said before, the FDA approved Epidiolex in 2018, which is a drug treatment for 2 severe forms of childhood seizures. So the passage of the 2018 Farm Bill has led to this misperception that all products made from or containing hemp, including those made with CBD, are now legal to sell in interstate commerce. And the result has been that storefronts and online retailers have flooded the market with these products, many with unsubstantiated therapeutic claims. The FDA has seen CBD appear in a wide variety of products like foods, dietary supplements, veterinarian products, cosmetics, all types of things. And as this new market is emerging, we have seen substantial interest from the industry, from consumers, and from Congress. However, in the midst of all this excitement and innovation, the FDA's role remains the same: to protect and promote the public health. And at present, any CBD food or purported dietary supplement products in interstate commerce is in violation of the FD&C Act due to the statutory provisions that I just discussed. But the FDA's biggest concern is the marketing of CBD products that make unsubstantiated therapeutic claims to prevent, diagnose, mitigate, treat, or cure serious diseases, but they have not obtained new drug approvals. So, for example, the FDA has seen various CBD products with claims of curing cancer or treating Alzheimer's, and the proliferation of these products may deter consumers from seeking proven, safe medical therapies for these serious illnesses, and it could potentially endanger their health or their life. The FDA's commitment to protecting their consumers from these unsubstantiated therapeutic claims does not just apply to CBD products. It is just this long-standing commitment of the agency across all the products they regulate. So under the Farm Bill, hemp-derived CBD became legal. Hemp farmers could apply for crop insurance. More banks were willing to work with those hemp companies, and big agriculture started moving into the hemp industry, and we saw an increase in sales, and the industry was in the billions by 2022. So the FDA has issued numerous warning letters to firms selling unapproved CBD drug products with claims to treat or prevent these serious diseases. And in fact, the agency began doing this in 2015, prior to that passage of the 2018 Farm Bill. And it's also worth noting that while investigating these unapproved CBD drug products, the FDA identified other concerns. Laboratory analysis of some of these products revealed that they didn't even contain any amount of CBD, or that they didn't contain the amount of CBD that was claimed on the product's label. And the products contained other substances that were not on the product's label, like other cannabinoids, like THC, which can really get somebody messed up. You claim that there's a high amount of CBD, and there's not, and you don't tell the person that it does contain THC, and then they are on probation and they get popped for a drug test, and they say, oh, well, I didn't know. Or they get popped for a drug test at work, and they get fired, and they lose their homes. This is a huge problem. And through the approval of the CBD-containing drug Epidiolex, which was based on adequate and well-controlled clinical studies, the FDA has learned that CBD is not a risk-free substance. During their review of marketing application for Epidiolex, they identified certain safety risks, including the potential for liver injury. And in that context, the risks are outweighed by the benefits of the approved drug to the particular population for which it's intended. The drug approval process offers significant benefits to prescribers and patients, including those who seek to prescribe or use hemp products for therapeutic purposes. Drug approvals generally are based on adequate and well-controlled clinical studies, which gives prescribers and patients confidence in the drug's safety and its effectiveness for that indicated use. And in addition, approved drugs have uniform strength, and they're consistent in the delivery that supports the appropriate dosing needed to treat patients, particularly patients with complex and serious conditions like epilepsy syndromes that Epidiolex was approved to treat. And patients using the approved prescription drug are under medical supervision to monitor any potential adverse effects of the drug. But for consumers who are just purchasing the types of CBD products that are proliferating throughout the marketplace, these protective factors are just not present. And although there are hundreds of strains of cannabis plants out there, there are three main species of plants that are most commonly grown. These are known as indicas, sativas, and ruderalis. And we're going to discuss sativas and indicas in a moment, but let's look at the species ruderalis for a moment. This species of cannabis is comprised of low THC. It's native to Central and Eastern Europe and Russia. A lot of people accept it as its own species due to its unique traits and phenotypes, which distinguish it from indica and sativa. But it's kind of widely debated as to whether or not ruderalis is a subspecies of sativa. It's smaller than the other species. It rarely grows over 2 feet high. It's thin, slightly fibrous stems, have very little branching. The foliage is typically open with large leaves. It usually reaches maturity much quicker than the other species, and it typically reaches maturity in 5 to 7 weeks from seed. Scientifically, it was identified in 1924 in southern Siberia, but it grows in the wild. The Russian botanist Januszewski was studying wild cannabis in the Volga River system and realized that he had come up with a third species. A lot of these are found in places where hemp was formerly grown in the US, but the most notable region is in the Midwest. It's used a lot in folk medicine for depression mostly, and because it has the lowest THC of the other biotypes, it is rarely used for recreational purposes. A lot of the time, people just cross it with strains that carry a higher medical prescription use, like sativas or indicas. Ruderellus does have higher levels of CBD, and it is valuable for patients looking to treat anxiety or epilepsy, and it's being used as a form of cancer treatment as well as for sclerosis and loss of appetite. So now let's talk about indicas. Indicas have this wide, broad leaf that's deep in color. Sativas, they have long, thin leaves that are lighter in color, but let's talk about indicas first. Indicas, they're short, they're bushy, they have these thick, broad leaves, a very short growth cycle. It's very suitable for indoor growth. We typically find these near Central Asia, and it grows between 30 to 50 degrees latitude. The effects of indicas are sedating, they're calming. We use it for anti-stress, sedation, sleep. They're physically soothing properties. Sativas, however, they're very tall and thin. They're suitable for outdoor gardens. We usually find it between 0 to 50 degrees latitude. The effects of the sativas, they tend to be uplifting, creative with cerebrally focused effects. We use it for depression, ADD, fatigue, mood disorders, things like that. For indicas, think relaxing effect. For sativas, think energizing effect. The way I remember this is indica, couch. You're going to be sitting there. And there's no really hard or fast rule. We just want to focus on the effects of the user for each particular strain. And we know that cannabis has been used since the dawn of time for medicinal purposes. The use waned as the popularity of opioids increased. Raphael McCollum, this dude he's great. But he was a scientist in Israel who was the first to isolate THC and CBD from the cannabis plant. He's the one that discovered that there are receptors in our body for these molecules. Nobody ever knew that. In 1992, he and his team discovered that there is a cannabinoid produced naturally by our bodies called anandamides, and there's another one called 2-AG. These anandamides form part of this wider system of communication in our bodies called the endocannabinoid system. And it's closely associated with our body's self-regulating processes like controlling temperature and our pH balance. It's involved in a lot of other aspects like our motor coordination, our neuroprotection, pain control, appetite, and it also helps our bodies to maintain homeostasis or a balance. And he was known as the father of cannabis research. McCollum is best known for his work with Gaoni. I can't pronounce his name, I'm sorry. But they worked together to isolate tetrahydrocannabinol or THC. And he was also successful in the isolation and identification of the endogenous cannabinoids, the anandamides from the brain, and the 2-AG or arachidonyl glycerol. from our peripheral organs. And his work has led to the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. And like I just said, it has effects on many important aspects of our human health. So these cannabinoid receptors are located throughout the body, and they make up the endocannabinoid system, which is involved in a variety of physiological processes, including our appetite, our pain sensation, our mood, our memory. And so we have receptor 1 and receptor 2. Receptor 1 is located mostly in the brain. Cannabinoid receptor 2 is located mostly in the immune system. So as you can see here, we have the brains, the lungs, the vascular system, our liver, our colon, our immune system, our spleen, our pancreas, our reproductive organs, our muscles, our bones. We have receptor sites all over the place. So we do know that there's currently 2 subtypes of cannabinoid receptors, the CB1 and the CB2. The CB1 receptor is expressed mainly in the brain, or our central nervous system, but also in the lungs, the liver, and the kidneys. The CB2 receptor is expressed mainly in the immune system and the hematopoietic cells. So mounting evidence suggests that there are novel cannabinoid receptors, that is, not the CB1 and CB2, which are expressed in endothelial cells and also in the central nervous system. So in 2007, the binding of several cannabinoids to the G protein coupled receptor, GPR55, in the brain was described. So there's another one out there that we don't really know about yet. And these cannabinoid receptors are a class of cell membrane receptors in the G protein coupled receptor superfamily. And as is typical of G protein coupled receptors, the cannabinoid receptors contain 7 transmembrane spanning domains. Cannabinoid receptors are activated by 3 major groups of ligands: endocannabinoids, produced by the mammillary body; plant cannabinoids, like CBD, produced by the cannabis plant; and then synthetic cannabinoids, like HU210. All of these endocannabinoids and photocannabinoids, which are plant-based, are lipophilic, which means that they're fat soluble. So that means that they can cross barriers. So we know that cannabis is the most commonly used substance among pregnant women, and human epidemiological and animal studies have found that prenatal cannabis exposure influences brain development, and it can have long-lasting impacts on cognitive functioning for that child. Exploration of the therapeutic potential of cannabis-based medicines and synthetic cannabinoid compounds has given us a lot of insight into the physiological roles of endogenous ligands, or endocannabinoids, and their receptors. So given the lipophilic nature of THC, it's estimated that 1/3 of the THC in the plasma crosses that fetal-placental barrier, and it's excreted also through the breast milk. And given the THC content of confiscated cannabis samples has increased substantially over the last 20 years, fetuses of cannabis-using mothers could be exposed to significant amounts of THC during that prenatal period. So cannabis abuse is potentially deleterious to the children of cannabis-using mothers through abnormal brain development, owing to the exogenous cannabis exposure during that prenatal period. And it's been shown that prenatal exposure to cannabis perturbs the fetal endogenous cannabinoid signaling system, which affects the neurodevelopment, and it results in abnormalities in cognition and neuropsychiatric disorders. So a central role for the endocannabinoid signaling in the brain development is now emerging. Perinatal and adolescent cannabis exposure may disrupt the precise temporal and spatial control of that signaling at critical stages of neurodevelopment. And that can lead to detrimental effects on later nervous system functioning. So these longitudinal studies in humans with prenatal cannabis exposure demonstrated exaggerated startile response and poor habituation to novel stimuli in infants, and hyperactivity, inattention, and impaired executive functioning in adolescents. A lot of these behavioral effects have also been modeled in animal studies. And possible teratogenic effects of endocannabinoid system-based therapies in pregnant women and long-term exposure to the endocannabinoid signaling. Those modifying agents like organophosphate pesticides also need to be taken into consideration. There was a study called the OPS study that found that prenatal marijuana exposure was highly correlated with an increase in exaggerated startles and tremors, and also with a significant reduction in habituation to light at the neonatal stage. Altered sleep patterns were found in the MHPCD study, and the authors also reported a non-significant trend towards increased irritability. Another study on neonates from adolescent mothers found in cannabis-exposed infants transiently increased irritability, excitability, and arousal after birth, between 24 to 72 hours after the birth. The MHPCD cohort also demonstrated that a higher amount of cannabis use per day, which was defined as more than 1 joint per day, during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy was associated with decreased mental scores of the Bayley scales of the infant development at 9 months of age, a difference that disappeared after 18 months. No cognitive deficit was observed during that childhood in the OPPS study, particularly between the ages of 1 to 3 years, suggesting that central nervous system abnormalities might be absent or subclinical in toddlers. For 3 to 4-year-old children, prenatal marijuana exposure negatively affected the verbal and memory domains in both the OPS and the MHPCD studied groups. Cognitive development assessed by the Stanford Binet Intelligence Scale just demonstrated a negative association of short-term memory and verbal reasoning with 1st or 2nd trimester marijuana use. Also, memory and verbal domains that were measured by the McCarthy scales of children's abilities decreased with daily marijuana use. But composite intelligence scores in both studies were not impacted at this age by maternal marijuana use. And then when children reached school age, around 5 or 6 years old, reports on the consequences of prenatal marijuana exposure begin to diverge. So exposed children from the OPS cohort appeared to have no memory deficits, while those from the MHPCD cohort report short-term memory deficits that correlate strongly with heavy 2nd trimester exposure. And then cannabis-exposed children in the OPS cohort scored significantly lower in tests for sustained attention, while those from the MHPCD group actually displayed increased attention, and they measured that by fewer errors of omission in a continuous performance task and all of this from the 2nd trimester exposure to cannabis. Both groups, however, reported an increase in impulsive and hyperactive behaviors. Then follow-up studies found that problems of depression, hyperactivity, inattention, and impulsivity persisted into the 9 to 12-year-old range, raising speculation of deficits in higher cognitive processing like executive functioning. So these cannabinoid receptors appear in the fetal brain around the 14th week of gestation. and they're concentrated in the hippocampus and the cerebellum and the amygdala and the cerebral cortex of the brain. These areas that subserve cognitive and behavioral functioning. The cannabinoid receptors play a really important role in the development of neuronal connectivity and intercellular signaling. Interference with endocannabinoid signaling during that fetal development can lead to long-term changes in synaptic structure and functioning. Exogenous cannabinoid, like THC, something coming from outside of the body, like THC, not something that's coming from within the body like the anandamides, but the THCs from outside interact with our cannabinoid receptors, and they are known to affect brain development in animals and humans. And that leads to the subsequent effects of PME, including increased mood and anxiety symptoms, behavior, cognitive and psychiatric problems. Early adolescence is also an important period in brain development. And during that time, development occurs in the limbic structures of the brain. And in parallel, the number of cannabinoid receptors increases in the cortolimbic region. So in early adolescence, there's this significant maturation in complex processes like a working memory, executive functioning, and emotional capacity. Exogenous cannabinoids like THC interfere with the functioning of the endogenous cannabinoid system, and it affects the maturation of the cortical neuronal networks during this very vulnerable period of time. And that leads to a dysregulation of the endogenous cannabis system or cannabinoid system, and a subsequent increase in PS and psychosis and things like that. So we know there have been studies that have shown that when a fetus is exposed in utero during the 14th through the 24th weeks, we know that any exposure whatsoever increases the likelihood that that child, by the time they turn 18 to 25, will develop schizophrenia. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit. So the existence of additional cannabinoid receptors has really just long been suspected, due to the actions of the compounds like abnormal cannabinol that produce cannabinoid-like effects on blood pressure and inflammation, but they don't activate either the CB1 or the CB2. So there's a distinct non-CB1 and CB2 receptor that responds to a variety of both endogenous and exogenous cannabinoid ligands. And that's led to some groups to suggest that GPR55 should be categorized as a CB3 receptor. Another possible cannabinoid receptor that's been located in the hippocampus, although its gene hasn't yet been cloned, suggests that there may be at least 2 more cannabinoid receptors to be discovered. In addition to that, there are to the 2 that are already known. GPR119 has been suggested as a possible 5th cannabinoid receptor, while the PPAR family of nuclear hormone receptors can also respond to certain types of cannabinoids. And cannabinoid receptors are activated by cannabinoids generated naturally inside the body, the endocannabinoids, or induced into the body as cannabinoids or a related synthetic compound. So basically, they're responding to what we already make in our bodies, what we get from outside of our bodies from the plants, and from these synthetic cannabinoids. And these similar responses are produced when introduced in alternative methods, only in a more concentrated form than what's naturally occurring. So after the receptor is engaged, these pathways are activated. And first we believe that the receptors inhibit the enzymes and are positively influenced inwardly, rectifying potassium channels. But we've learned that there is a lot more going on than that, including increased calcium channels and various proteins. And THC and two major endogenous compounds identified so far bind to these cannabinoid receptors, the anandamides and the 2-AG, and they produce most of their effects by binding to both these receptors, while the effects mediated by CB1, mostly in the central nervous system, have been thoroughly investigated. Those mediated by CB2 are not equally well defined. So basically, we know what's going on in the central nervous system with these things, but we have no clue what's going on in our immune system. So let's talk a bit about cannabis use disorder. This is a diagnosis that's given for problematic marijuana use. The diagnosis was introduced in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, the 5th edition, or the DSM-5. In the previous edition, the DSM-4-TR, problematic use of cannabis or marijuana was separated into two different disorders, cannabis abuse and cannabis dependence. So does this mean that cannabis is not addictive, like tissue dependence or psychological? With the disappearance of the cannabis dependence, some people might interpret the change of the disorder name to a single disorder to imply that cannabis is not addictive. And cannabis does not lead to drug dependence. After all, it has had a long reputation of being, quote unquote, a soft drug. A lot of consideration went into deciding how cannabis use disorder should be described in the DSM-5. A lot of cannabis users deny any addictive aspects of the drug, but many do appear to become addicted. Cannabis use disorder captures the possibility that people can be negatively impacted by their marijuana use without necessarily being addicted. But it also has room to recognize addiction when and if it does happen. So, is there tissue dependence? And the answer is yes. We can have tissue dependence to cannabis because we can have withdrawal from the substance. And I'll talk about withdrawal more later. So it should be noted that the DSM-5 is a catalog of mental disorders. Substance use disorder, substance-induced disorders are part of the DSM-5. The substance use disorders based on this inclusion are a mental disorder. And there are specific criteria that outline and define the presentation and severity of SUDs. The criteria, from what I've seen and heard, a lot of people, even people from substance use who have a substance use disorder, they define SUDs in a way that kind of leaves some things out. A lot of times people point to, an initial decision or choice to use the drug, or maybe using a specific drug, or using drugs in a particular way, or suffering a certain set of consequences as, quote unquote, the problem. But that's not it. We can't just I hear a lot of people say, oh, well, I wasn't that bad off, or I could still go to work and keep using, or I could still take care of my kids when I get high, or things like that. I could still drive, things of that nature. And so they kind of use the effects to say, oh, well, I wasn't addicted because I didn't have these issues. But the DSM-5 has 11 criteria to diagnose somebody with a cannabis use disorder. And those are very similar to an alcohol use disorder. So let's look at some of these criteria. So the DSM-5 says that there is a problematic pattern of cannabis use leading to clinically significant impairment or distress as manifested by at least two of the following occurring during a 12-month period. So if any two of these happen significantly, in a 12-month period, then we can say that the person has a cannabis use disorder. So the first one is using it in larger amounts or for longer periods of time than intended. What does that look like? I said I was going to have 6 beers and I had 16. I said I was going to go to the bar for happy hour and I shut the place down. I said I was going to go drink Friday night and I also drank Saturday and Sunday. The second criteria is unsuccessful efforts to cut down or quit. So this looks like, I made a promise to my wife that I would quit using, but I tried and was unable to quit using. Or I made a decision to limit the amount of drugs I use in a day, and I tried but was unable to limit my use. The third criteria is excessive time spent getting, using, or intoxicated or recovering from the effects. So this looks like when asked about how much time did you spend, a general response that I have gotten is, it's like a full-time job. And I'll usually joke with somebody when we're talking about this, and I say, if you ever waited for a drug dealer, then you have to answer yes for this question. The fourth one is craving or intense desires or urges to use substances. So let's use an analogy here. Every new year when you say you're going to quit eating sweets and you make it a few weeks, but then that thing just takes over and you obsess about ice cream, then you smash an entire pint of Ben & Jerry's. Is it like that? Or craving similar to that of your desire for water after working outside in the yard on a hot day. I'll kind of ask them that question. Or when the morning meeting ran over and you didn't get to eat lunch until 2 p.m. and you're really craving that sandwich, right? That would be the type of intense craving that we're talking about here. The fifth category, or the fifth thing here is failure to fulfill your major obligations. So your job performance suffers as a result of using your substances. An inability to parent, getting kicked out of school or fired from your job. Your bills don't get paid because you spent too much money on the substance. You don't participate in family or friendship roles anymore because they're hassling you about your substance use, or you just don't want them to know. You skipped out on the birthday party because they don't drink, or you were too drunk to go, or you were too high to go, things like that. The sixth piece here is continuing use despite social or interpersonal problems. So I might ask, even though all that stuff has happened in the last 5 questions, did you keep using anyway? If they answer yes, they would, this criteria right here would be met. The 7th criteria is activities or hobbies reduced or given up. So I used to play in the basketball rec league, now I don't. I used to be heavily involved in the arts community, now I'm not. I used to be an avid outdoorsman, and I haven't been involved in those activities for over a year, things like that. The 8th one is recurrent use in physically hazardous situations. So this looks like using abandoned houses and properties to get high, working with heavy equipment and using the substance on the job, getting high and driving, things like that. The 9th criteria is recurrent use despite physical or psychological problems caused by or worsened by the use. So maybe you have Hep C and you use drugs intravenously. You have an abscess, but you keep using anyway. You have a major depressive disorder and use depressant substances. You have cirrhosis of the liver and you continue to drink, things like that. The 10th criteria is tolerance. So maybe you used to use twice a day. Now, to maintain the desired effect, you use 5 times a day. When I'm talking about pills, I'll say 3 pills used to make me feel great. Now, to get that same effect, I have to take 6. Things like that. With withdrawal is the 11th criteria. What's this look like? When I don't have the substance, I'm physically or psychologically affected, like insomnia, nausea, vomiting, restlessness, tremors, seizures, depressed mood, anxiety, irritability. I've heard people say that they start having these really vivid dreams after they stop using marijuana. They become restless, they have insomnia, they can't sleep, they can't eat. Um, After they stop smoking, just food just doesn't seem appealing to them anymore. And it could be because of the whole the endocannabinoid system regulating our metabolism. So we've interfered with that regulation while we were using. So now we we don't have that same regulation anymore, and the body is just trying to get back to homeostasis. So it'll be a while before you eat properly again. Then we have to think about specifiers and severity. Early remission means that within 1 year, a patient has not had any symptoms of dependence for at least 3 months. Sustained remission means that within a year, a patient has not had any symptoms except for a strong desire or urge to drink or use drugs. And then we need to code based on the severity. So, for example, if there's a comorbid cannabis-induced anxiety disorder and cannabis use disorder, only the cannabis-induced anxiety disorder code is given, with the fourth character indicating whether the comorbid cannabis use disorder is mild, moderate, or severe. So I might say F12.180 for mild cannabis use disorder with cannabis-induced anxiety disorder. So basically, the F12 ICD-10 code is for cannabis, period, just for cannabis. And then we're going to code for severity. So point 1 would be abuse. Anything with a point 2 would be dependence. And point 9 would just be use. And then that next number would be indicating if there's any other disorder that's associated with it, with intoxication, with withdrawal, with some sort of other whatever mood disorder. So that would be the next number. So it would be F12.1 for the abuse, point 2 for the dependence, and point 9 for any just use, period. Now let's move into a little bit of the methods of administration. So we know that marijuana can be smoked in joints like a cigarette, in blunts like cigars or cigar wrappers that have been partly or completely refilled with marijuana, or in bongs, pipe bongs or water bongs. It can also be mixed or infused into foods like cookies, cakes, brownies. We call these edibles. And it can also be infused into drinks. I've seen some drinks on the market. It can be smoked in vapor devices. It can also be infused into topicals and gels. There are concentrated versions of cannabis that people call dabs that are extremely powerful concentrates. And of all the THC being sold in Colorado, edibles make up 40% of the market. So we know this is one of the most popular forms of administration. And edibles aren't just brownies anymore. They're made into and from everything. Suckers, mints, caramels, chocolates, gummy bears, gummy worms, sour gummies, tarts, breath sprays, sodas, hot cocoa, hard candies, taffy, candy bars, coffee, ice cream, cotton candy, main course meals, side dishes. If you can eat it, somebody has probably put THC into it and sold it in Colorado. Edibles typically take 30 minutes to 4 hours for the effect to take in. So it takes a while. It's not immediate like when we smoke. And so 11% of ER marijuana visits are for edibles. And the reason why people are going to the ER is because they're having psychotic breaks. It's not because they're having what we would typically consider an overdose of what an opioid overdose looks like. A cannabis overdose or THC overdose is psychological. And so we are seeing things that aren't there, hearing things that aren't actually there, and people are having these psychotic breaks. And the reason why they're having these, I'll get into it in just a moment, but they're Our bodies are not designed to handle that much THC, and these people are putting so much of it in there. And also, people are consuming too much because they don't know what dose to take. Should I eat the whole cookie or just a bite of it? And so, let's say the dose was one bite, these people are eating the whole cookie, and that is way too much THC for the body to handle at one time. And what they're doing is they're taking regular gummy bears, they're washing them off, spraying them with concentrated THC, rolling them in sugar, and repackaging them. And the majority of THC gummy bears in Colorado contain 40 milligrams of THC in each gummy bear. That is not 4 servings per bag or even 1 serving per bear, but it is 4 times the legal limit in each gummy bear. They keep putting 4 to 20 servings in a gummy bear, and they tell the public that it's their duty to cut that gummy bear into fourths or 20ths and consume responsibly. And I don't know about you, but I'm not just going to cut off the ear or the hand or the foot of a gummy bear and eat it. The Food and Drug Administration doesn't let this kind of deception happen with food products, but they can't touch these products because they're federally illegal. Multiple servings in one goodie is a mistake. And concentrates are to weed what crack is to the cocoa plant. Think of it as like a turbo effect. Consider that for the 25 and under crowd, when we say marijuana, they are thinking concentrates. They're not thinking about what was 20 years ago. So that's what you mean when you say marijuana. You're talking about a concentrated form of it. And these concentrates typically contain 8 to 95% THC. And concentrates hit so hard that, even half the size of a pinhead puff very often puts an experienced weed smoker on their back within a couple of seconds. And you could need a spotter right there so that when you pass out, somebody can catch you before you hit the floor. Or have a trash can ready for when you vomit the contents of your stomach. And scientists don't have a lot of research on these concentrates because, like I said, it's been by and large illegal. Cannabis plants are covered by microscopic mushroom-shaped hair-like compounds called trichomes. And these outgrowths surround the budding marijuana flower and produce the plant's cannabinoids. Different varieties of trichomes can be collected, and the resulting products, collectively called cannabis concentrates, can contain very high levels of tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. And these THC-rich marijuana products can be vaporized and inhaled using a vape pen or through a process called dabbing. And marijuana concentrates can be made in a commercial environment with modern equipment or prepared in a home setting. And they're produced in a bunch of different ways: dry processing, dry ice processing, water based processing, combining pressure with heat, using non flammable carbon dioxide solvents, using flammable solvents, including butane lighter fluid, propane, ether, or alcohol. And using flammable solvents is popular because the products have high THC levels and users report longer lasting effects. And it's relatively inexpensive and efficient production methods. So, butane is a commonly used solvent, and it produces the potent marijuana concentrate butane hashish oil, or BHO. And the products that result from these methods might be a gooey liquid or wax, which you see pictured, or a soft solid with like a texture like a lip balm, or a hard amber color solid. And hash oil and waxes can be consumed using vape pens. Solids can also be placed on a heated platform, usually made of titanium, quartz, or ceramic, where they are vaporized by high heat and inhaled through a dabbing tool, which is often called a rig. The terms used to describe these products typically vary. Concentrates is just this broad term that refers to all the products that have been extracted from the plant. And although extracts and concentrates can be used interchangeably, some people define extracts as products manufactured using solvents, but not those pulled from the plants with non-solvent methods. Dabs may refer to products made exclusively from butane hash oil. However, the term is sometimes colloquial for concentrates extracted in other ways. So there's also this post-modern or post-production method that leads to further variations in products and terms. And we know that there's adverse effects associated with marijuana use in any form, though additional research is needed, to understand how the use of concentrates may differ from smoking dried marijuana buds. But marijuana concentrates have very high levels of THC. Solvent-based products tend to be especially potent, with THC levels documented at an average of about 54 to 69% and reported to exceed 80% sometimes. While the non-solvent-based extraction methods produce average THC levels between 39 to 60%. In comparison, the THC content in the marijuana plant material, which is often used in marijuana cigarettes, is lower, with samples seized by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency averaging on just over 15%. Not only do concentrates have high levels of THC, but dabbers inhale the entire amount all at once in a single breath. And as a result, concentrates deliver extremely large amounts of THC to the body very quickly. And the risks of physical dependence and addiction increase with exposure to high concentrations of THC, and higher doses of THC are more likely to produce anxiety, agitation, paranoia, and psychosis. And additional research is needed to understand how the use of concentrates affects these risks. And in addition, contaminants in the concentrate products may also be a cause for concern. One study noted that 80% of tested concentrate samples were contaminated in some form, not only with pesticides, which is also a concern for the dried buds, but also with residual solvents that were not fully purged in the manufacturing processes. So users of the BHO, for example, likely inhale some butane and other impurities along with the vaporized THC. So it's important to note that direct inhalation of concentrated butane among that recreational inhalant users carries multiple risks, including reported deaths. But it's unclear what negative health outcomes result from the inhalation of the residual butane or the other solvents or the leftover contaminants during that dabbing process. And when solvents are used to produce concentrates, the preparation process itself can be dangerous. A number of people using butane to make extracts at home have caused fires and explosions, and they've been seriously burned. A study that was conducted in 2015 looking at implications from marijuana legalization in Colorado reported that in a 2-year period, the University of Colorado Burn Center saw a substantial increase in the number of flash burns that occurred during amateur THC extraction using butane, some involving more than 70% of body surface area, and most requiring skin grafting. It's against federal law to manufacture a BHO, but even in some states where adult use of marijuana is legal, like Colorado and California, it's still illegal to make hash oil using flammable liquids. In Colorado, state officials recommended alternative methods using non-flammable dry ice like CO2 or ice water, or purchasing the product from a licensed marijuana retail store. Most licensed commercial production facilities use a safer extraction system that prevents solvents from being wasted or exposed to the open air where they could inadvertently be ignited. Similar to decades-old systems that are used in the production of a lot of different commercial products. Now let's talk about hybrids. In the past, in the 60s and the 70s, cannabis contained only 4% THC, but today's plant can contain up to 90% THC. So this is not your mama's marijuana. It's not what your grandma and your mom were using back in high school. We know the natural levels of THC and CBD are under 1%, but the plant has been hybrid. So nature gave us this plant with the potential medical benefits that have very subtle intoxicating effects. And we know that CBD counteracts the psychedelic effects of the THC. And they are modifying these new plants to contain more THC and less CBD for a greater high. We've learned how to breed marijuana into what we want, a drug that gets us higher. And our kids keep getting the message that weed is a natural and safe substance that should be used to promote good physical and mental health. But they're not getting that. We see that back in 1995, it was 4% THC levels. In 2017, it was 17%. And now we can buy pre-rolled joints with 28% and concentrates with 85 to 90% THC. And our bodies are not designed to handle that at all. Vape pens today can combust THC or weed in just about any form and do it without leaving a smell. And if it's not bad enough that a student could be eating or chewing or sucking on or drinking THC right in front of a teacher, now they can actually smoke it or vape it in class. So if a vaporizer can combust concentrates at 700 plus degrees, what else can it combust? Crack? Heroin? Meth? So many different drugs that we can turn into concentrates now and put these in these pens and make it odorless and vaporless, and we don't have the smoke filling the air. The marijuana industry didn't intend to create a tool to smoke meth with no smell, but they did create or enhance a tool that works for all of these substances. And people can now combust what the world accepts as hard drugs in these vape pens, making drugs easier for people to use, and for kids to get away with using them is not a good idea. Let's talk a little bit about the medicinal use of cannabis. So medical marijuana uses the marijuana plant or the chemicals that are in it to treat diseases or conditions. And it's basically the same product as recreational marijuana, but it's taken for medical purposes. So the marijuana plant contains more than 120 different chemicals called cannabinoids, like we discussed. And each one has a different effect on the body. So THC, or delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or cannabidiol, which is CBD, are the main chemicals used in medicine. So THC also produces the high people feel when they smoke marijuana or eat foods that contain it. So what is it used for? Medical marijuana is used to treat a number of different conditions, including Alzheimer's disease, appetite loss, cancer, Crohn's disease, eating disorders like anorexia, epilepsy, glaucoma, mental health conditions like schizophrenia or post-traumatic stress disorder, multiple sclerosis, muscle spasms, nausea, pain, wasting syndrome. But it's not yet proven to help many of these conditions, with a few exceptions. The greatest amount of evidence for the therapeutic effects of cannabis relate to its ability to reduce chronic pain, like nausea and vomiting due to chemotherapy, and the spasticity or the tight or stiff muscles from MS. And these cannabinoids, the active chemicals in the medical marijuana, are similar to the chemicals that the body makes that are involved in appetite and memory and movement and pain. So, research suggests that cannabinoids might reduce anxiety or reduce inflammation and relieve pain and control nausea and vomiting caused by the cancer chemotherapy. And it can even kill cancer cells and slow the tumor growth and relax tight muscles in the people with MS and stimulate appetite and improve weight gain in people with cancer and AIDS. And we already talked about this before, but medical marijuana received a lot of attention a few years ago when parents said that, or the parents of children said that the special form of the drug helped control seizures in their children. And like we talked about before, the FDA approved Epidiolex, which is made from CBD, as a therapy for people with very severe or hard to treat seizures. In studies, some people had a dramatic drop in seizures after taking this drug. And in fact, Charlotte Figi, she was from Colorado. She actually inspired the CBD movement to control seizures, and she just passed away in 2020 from COVID-related symptoms. Her entire family got COVID, and everybody in the family was cured of it except for her. And that was a huge blow to the CBD movement. And there was an article several years ago showing that synthesized CBD, or about 10,000 times that found in the plant, actually reduced the size and growth of some brain tumors. It also affects our sleep. A little bit helps, but if you take too much, it can keep you awake. The dosage is what's important. More is not always better. So for like anxiety, volunteers in a research study actually reduced their use of benzodiazepines by 47%, but the amount that was consumed of the THC or the cannabis actually mattered. So 7.5 milligrams, which is about an edible, reduced the anxiety, but 12.5 milligrams actually increased anxiety. Cannabis is also effective for cancer pain, but it's not a cure for cancer as many think it might be. There's some real evidence that weed helps with some conditions like wasting syndrome associated with AIDS and HIV, and muscle spasticity associated with MS, and improving your appetite in some patients undergoing chemo. There's some anecdotal evidence of helping with seizures in young children, but we don't know how much of this is placebo and how much of it is actually psychological. There's a lot more testing that needs to be done. So let's talk about the dangers of marijuana use. And we also saw in Colorado that hospital admissions for children under 12 who accidentally consumed THC actually went up 800% after the legalization of marijuana recreational and medicinally there. We also know that cannabis causes amotivational syndrome, or a lack of motivation. So people just don't want to do anything while they're smoking weed. And cannabinoids biologically make you forget, so it does impact your short-term and your long-term memory. And as I discussed before, it does increase the risk of developing schizophrenia if the mother uses cannabis while pregnant. But research shows that in 15 to 25-year-old males, heavy abusive levels of consumption do lead to psychosis or an unmasking effect that aggravates existing schizophrenia. But the evidence is based on heavy cannabis abuse over a long period of time, and research shows this typically involves high levels of THC. So the higher level the THC and the longer and more the person uses it when they are in their adolescence, the more likely they are to either give themselves schizophrenia or unmask schizophrenia at an earlier age than what it would have been. And then there's also withdrawal, and we talked about withdrawal earlier. There's irritability, mood swings, lack of being able to eat, insomnia, things of that nature when you are going through withdrawal. And not much is known about how marijuana or the components of it actually interact with each other, or with prescriptions or non-prescription medications, and that's just scary. So until we have a better idea of how this drug actually interacts with users' brains and bodies, We need to hit the brakes and remind the industry that just because we can do something does not mean that we should. And we're starting to see more THC-induced psychosis in Colorado. Like I said, the higher the THC, our body's not designed to handle that. And so psychosis-induced suicides and murders have actually occurred. There's a book, Marijuana Sanity or Cannabis Sanity, I can't remember what it's called, but the guy that's writing the book is taking all of these instances and putting them in this book. And he recounts a story of a guy who jumped off a balcony. What had happened, he had no mental health history whatsoever, and he and his family had gone to Colorado on vacation. He was in college, and he ate a half of a cannabis cookie. Now, initially, he ate the 1/4, as he was supposed to. That was the serving size according to the packaging, and it didn't work. And of course, he didn't realize that it takes between 30 minutes to 4 hours for an edible to actually take effect. And so, because he wasn't feeling the effects of it, he ate another 1/4 of the cookie. So he had a whole half of a cannabis cookie. And he ended up having a psychotic break. He thought people were chasing after him, and he ended up smashing everything in this hotel room and jumping off the balcony to his death. There's another situation also noted in this book where there was a guy, he was eating a bag of THC gummies, peach rings, and he was just popping the peach rings like the whole bag. I don't think he ate the whole bag, but he was just eating gummy after gummy after gummy. And when he got home, he actually had a psychotic break, and he shot his pregnant wife in front of their 2 children. And so the 2 children were later able to sue the edible company for their product packaging. And it was actually the first wrongful death suit for any of the marijuana edibles companies out there. And we have to worry about the effects of vaping and CBD. These risks include respiratory irritation, increased risks of cardiovascular disease, and also the potential for addiction. In addition to that, the long-term effects of vaping CBD oil are not really fully understood, and further research is needed to determine the potential for the long-term health risks. And lastly, I want to talk about this photo that was taken in May 2018. This photo was provided by Joseph Jenkins, and Joseph Jenkins' son, Jay, is laying in the emergency room at the Lexington Medical Center in Lexington, South Carolina. So Jay Jenkins suffered an acute respiratory failure and drifted into a coma. According to his medical records, after, he says, he vaped a product that was labeled as a smokable form of the cannabis extract CBD. Lab testing commissioned as part of an Associated Press investigation into CBD vapes showed that the cartridge that Jenkins says that he puffed contained a synthetic marijuana compound that's blamed for at least 11 deaths in Europe. Some operators are cashing in on the CBD craze by substituting cheap and illegal synthetic marijuana for natural CBD in vapes and edibles like gummy bears. And the Associated Press investigation found that out. The practice has sent dozens of people like Jenkins to the emergency room over the last couple of years. And the people behind these spiked products have operated with impunity, in part because the business has boomed so fast that regulators haven't caught up, while the drug enforcement agents have, higher priorities. But the Associated Press commissioned laboratory testing of the vape oil Jenkins used, plus 29 other vape products that were sold as CBD around the country, with a focus on brands that authorities or users flagged as suspect. And 10 of those 30 contained types of synthetic marijuana, drugs that we know as K2 or spice, and they have no known medical benefits. And some of those had no CBD at all. So we need to be mindful of what's being presented to us as a whole and know that these things are not regulated by the FDA. We don't know what's in them, and we can't just trust the packaging because the FDA has no hand in the packaging at all.